To my far left is Evan Hughes. He was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in Reporting in 2015. He has written for my rag, the New York Times, and the New York Times Magazine, GQ, New York Magazine, Wired, and the New York Review of Books. He is the author of Literary Brooklyn. Representative Madeleine Dean is the Congresswoman for the 4th District of Pennsylvania, that's in suburban Philadelphia, a member of the House Judiciary and House Financial Services Committees, and Vice Chair of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus. From 2012 to 2018, she served in the Pennsylvania House. From 2001 to 2011, she taught writing at LaSalle University, and she has contributed to Newsweek, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Philadelphia Daily News, and other regional publications. She and her husband, P.J. Kinane, live in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, and have 3 sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and 3 grandchildren. Madeleine collaborated with one of her sons, Henry, whom we will refer to as Harry, on this book.
He's just Harry.
Oh, so that's a miswriting.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
He's Harry.
Under Our Roof, a son's battle for recovery, a mother's battle for her son. Before I start, I want to set the table for these 2 very accomplished authors. I've read deeply both books, and they are very different, and they're each terrific.
We're good.
You're good? Okay. We are now in what some people call the 3rd wave of the opioid epidemic. The first wave was from about 2000 to about 2016, primarily led by OxyContin and then joined by many other prescription opioids. As the DEA and the FDA and doctors began to crack down on the overuse of prescription opioids, the country began the 2nd wave, known as the heroin epidemic. And now we are in the terrible 3rd wave, which is fentanyl. As an example, from about 1996 to 2016, the country lost about 500,000 people to opioid overdoses. That includes prescription pill and street drugs. Last year alone, in 2021, we lost 105,000 people, mostly to fentanyl. It is a very complicated epidemic. It involves behavior, the law, interdiction, intercession, and mental health. It is impossible to convey in one talk the full range of the opioid epidemic. But Evan has captured in his book an extraordinary and meticulous account of how one company went terribly awry. And it is an instructive takedown, and it is really a page-turner about how big pharma could go so wrong. The Congresswoman's book is equally meticulous in its own way, and for those of us here who are parents or know people who have been caught up in substance use disorders, it is a harrowing and passionate and intimate double-track tale worked on by her son, Harry, who got caught up in this world, and her own struggles as a mother to realize what was going on with him and how she and he worked together to come into recovery. So again, 2 poles of a very large tent, and let's see what we can explore together. Evan, tell everybody here about Jan Kapoor. Who is he?
So Jan Kapoor was the founder of Insys Therapeutics, which is the company that I sort of go deep inside in this book. It's not a book, a sort of issue book that tries to take on the whole opioid epidemic. It's really inside this one company, examining the mechanics of how pharma contributed to the epidemic. He was born in India in poverty, came to the United States, in many ways a classic immigrant success story, got his PhD, made millions as a biopharma entrepreneur, investing in various ventures, and then late in his career wanted to found this company. And the origin story that he told is that it was about his wife had died of cancer, and she suffered from terrible pain near the end. And so he invented this drug. Invented is maybe a strong word because it's fentanyl, which had been around since 1960 and used in hospital settings. If you get an epidural, there's fentanyl in there usually. But he invented a product that would be used for so-called breakthrough cancer pain, which is like very severe spikes of pain that you might have in the end stages of cancer. So he was a visionary, a scientist. He loved tinkering and talking about his inventions. He gave a lot of money to charity. In many ways, he's the villain of this book, but I think a complicated figure.
So John Kapoor had a remarkable cast of foot soldiers whom Evan describes in the book. I mean, they are, some of them are quite outlandish, to say the least. And they are all now serving federal sentences. My question for you, because to some extent this book is about a very powerful boss who leads everybody off the cliff. And I was really interested in that process. So if it's possible, can you talk about what characteristics the foot soldiers had in common that made them vulnerable to him? Because they certainly had, some of them had experience in pharma before, but they weren't as egregious an actor as they were until they came under his spell. How was he able to command their loyalty and willingness to overlook and even blatantly abet illegal activity?
I mean, I think that's a good one. I think they, part of it began with, it's sometimes like lawyers who work for companies say, tone at the top is the most important thing. And the tone that John Kapoor set was, I only want to work with the most aggressive people, the ones with kind of no brakes. And so it's not an accident that he gathered people like that. But then I think once they were under the roof, so to speak, one of them described it to me as kind of a dysfunctional family where there's this father figure and the rest of them were quite young for the positions of responsibility that they had. They were sort of late 30s, early 40s, and, running the show. And he was in his early 70s and, this sort of brutally demanding father, and they all kind of cowered in fear of him, but also respected him. He was a kind of mentor figure that they wanted his approval, which was hard to get. And they brought out the worst, I think, in one another.
Yeah, it's almost as if they all may have had a moral compass at some point, but out the window.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things I wanted to do in the book was not to, write a tirade about how bad these people were, which is sort of obvious. Like, that book doesn't need to be written. It's a book about how people who are kind of very recognizable and somewhat normal, you wouldn't meet them and think they were the personification of evil or something, but how they could get to this place and be a part of something so bad, and their sort of blindness to the consequences of what they were doing. They didn't meet the patients. What they thought about was getting market share from their competitors, who were in many ways equally unscrupulous. So it's kind of it's a book that's sort of told from the bad guy's eye view.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those egregious bad acts were, to give you an idea of, I think offensive underplays the extent of what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Tell everybody what's a whale.
A whale is a term borrowed from gambling, right? The whale is the heavy hitter at the table that the casino wants to draw in. The whale in this case is a big-time prescriber of opioids. And what INSIS did was zero in on the whales. Pharma companies have this incredibly fine-grained data about who is prescribing their product.
How do they get that data?
That's kind of amazing. I think not everybody knows this, but that data is available. Pharmacies sell it to these companies like IMS Health is the best known one, and they sell it to drug companies. And it's not, there aren't names attached to it. You know, it's anonymized for patients and actually even for doctors, but it's very easy to divine who the doctor is. And then they, you know, send their representatives to the office of that doctor, and like that's their number one person. And so, you know, there's like a certain logic to it. If you were a wholesaler of lawnmowers, you'd probably go to the Home Depots of the world. You're not going to go to the corner. You know, it's like more bang for your buck. But there's something really ugly, right? When who you're going to is the most prolific prescribers of opioids, who tend to be, you know, unscrupulous. They're sort of looking for side deals to build their practice, and Insys made those side deals. And so, like, the scandal in a nutshell was that they signed up these doctors for a speaker program that really was a sham. It was pay the doctors to conduct these little speaker programs in restaurants, but the speaking programs don't really matter. And in fact, sometimes there was no audience at all. It was just pay the doctor to go out to dinner. And they were very explicit about what we expect in return, which is to write prescriptions for our drug. So the Department of Justice calls that a kickback. So, so that's how they got in hot water. And there is another element to the scam that I think Jan wants me to go into later. But
Yeah, later.
yeah.
All right, because I want you to sort of experience at least the degree of nausea that I felt as I was reading this. Tell us about the biggest whale of all, who's now, by the way, this case was just argued before the Supreme Court.
I was going to say, there's a few candidates for the biggest whale of all.
Right. When you realize who this guy is and realize there is a chance he could get freed from prison if the court rules a certain way.
So there were a pair of doctors in Mobile, Alabama, who operated the biggest pain clinic around, and Dr. Couch and Dr. Ron, Shulu Ron, and he was an immigrant from China, and similarly kind of a hard-driving businessman. Like, you know, one hopes that the doctor's first priority is the patient, but this doctor's first priority was build the business. And
they were pain doctors specifically, though.
Pain doctors specifically, yes, and high prescribers of all kinds of opioids, and susceptible to this kind of side deal, you know, and it wasn't even just Insys and their speaker program. They were kind of, you know, there's a big business in toxicology. The urine samples that pain clinics are required to take from patients, you make a deal with a toxicology company that analyzes those cups, and it's like incredibly lucrative, so they would kick back money to the doctor. It's all this stuff that goes on kind of behind the scenes when you're a patient that you know nothing about.
Well, you wrote about the fact that they also had in their clinic their own pharmacy, so it was endless.
Right. They were able to
Can you just give a quick description of how large off the land Dr. Wan lived?
He collected 18 luxury cars.
I mean, anything after 16 is useless.
And he sort of set up a showroom of them. He loved to show them off, and like they had like a plaque in front of each one so you could walk around. I mean, really outlandish, and it makes you wonder about failures of regulation that...
I'm going to ask you all about that later.
You know, these guys got all the way to being arrested, a little bit of a spoiler there, but they were never... The state medical board never got them.
And they often rarely actually saw the patients themselves.
Yep, they had so-called mid-levels, like a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant would do all the work for them.
Whom you describe as also being on opioids.
Yeah, they were themselves suffering from opioid addiction. So really just, I mean, the worst kind of behavior, and Insys and the other companies knew about it. You know, at least to a degree.
And I won't unpack the Supreme Court case in front of you now because, you need to stay awake. But, but there is, I wrote about the case a little bit. I listened to the argument, as did Evan, and there is a reasonable chance that Dr. Ron will, at the very least, get a sentence reduction or a new trial, which is extraordinary. So let me move on to one more egregious failing, and then I need to give some airtime to the Congressman's wonderful book. Can I have an extra hour, please? So, in addition to the courting of the whales, which is something that still certainly goes on in Big Pharma, the difference between INSIS and Big Pharma was, of course, a question of scale, and this was just overt bribery. INSIS did something else. You want to talk about the in-house call center?
Sure. So it was kind of a
prior authorization.
Yeah. So it was kind of a two-part scheme. First, you bribe the doctors essentially to prescribe the drug, but then you've got all these prescriptions for an extremely expensive drug. I haven't mentioned that, but it's like tens of thousands a month. And whereas, oxycodone or something could be a few dollars. So, of course, the insurers are gatekeepers, right? So they want to know, wait, why is this drug necessary? Is this person actually suffering from cancer? What's the situation? So that it's prior authorization, like which you have sometimes when you go to the hospital or something. So the drugs had to be approved by insurance. So INSIS came up with this idea that instead of like farming this out to companies that do this, or letting the doctor's office do it, which is really the proper way, they would handle the paperwork, and they would essentially deceive the insurance companies and sometimes outright lie. The question would come up, does this patient have breakthrough cancer pain? And they had this little spiel they would say in order to lend the impression to this like lowly call center worker on the other end of the line that the answer was yes when the answer was clearly no. So, the approval rate went up and up and up, way beyond what the competitors were, and it was outright insurance fraud.
This is a great and chilling and depressing book. And I will say one reason to read it, to use the expression we use in the daily newspaper trade, the kicker is devastating.
Well,
the kicker is devastating. Let me just go back because that raises the question of what do we do about this. So the Congresswoman's book is, I'm not a critic, I find it both devastating and beautiful. And it's sort of magnificently written. And it, I'm not going to cry. It follows two tracks simultaneously. Her son Harry recounts his experiences as he gets deeper and deeper into the world of drugs. And her experience as a mother, as a lawyer, as a professor of writing, and then a sort of newbie politician who begins to figure out something is terribly wrong with her son, until ultimately the tracks dovetail. So, why did you feel compelled to write this book?
First of all, it's great to be with you, Jan, with you, Evan, and I thank the festival for the invitation. We didn't. We were asked to write it. It didn't even occur to us to write a book. It really didn't. But my eldest son, his brother Pat, had written a book, and his agent came to him and said, "Pat, do you have a second book in you?" And he said, "No, but my mother and brother might have an interesting story to tell." So his agent came to us, said, "Would you consider writing a book about your story?" And we immediately seized on it and said, if we could help somebody, absolutely. So it had never dawned on us to write a book.
So there are many examples in the book in which Harry is getting deeper and deeper trouble, and you have no idea at the time. What did each of you learn about each other's journeys as you worked on the book, and what episode of Harry shocked you the most?
Well, we were asked to write the book. It was late summer of 2018, so I was just deep into a first congressional race. And what we did, we actually literally had once a got farther along, we had a little Congress camp, and he and I wrote an outline. I was here and he was there, and we wrote a little outline, and we both agreed, go your separate way. You write your side, I'll write mine. I don't want my memory interfered with. I'm struggling to make sure I get it as accurately as I can. So we literally wrote half the book separately, first few chapters completely on our own. And then we got halfway through, and my eldest son began to dovetail them together. And that's the first time I read Harry's story. I knew through my life experience, for the experience with Harry and our struggles and our battles. I mean, it was a most unhappy place. We were battling. We were at each other. I was drug testing him, and I couldn't find the answers. I was also getting him medically tested.
Which, by the way, in one incredibly harrowing episode, he eludes the test. Remember when he takes the vial and he sticks it in his hospital gown
and goes and breaks it in a bathroom. I finally thought I have him. He's got to go get blood tested for a different reason at the hospital, and I thought surely that will be the ultimate blood test. And we're in the ER, and they dismissed him way too early. He had recovered from the episode he was in, and I said, but what about his blood work? Oh yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Well, obviously they never looked. They didn't have the blood. He destroyed the blood. The most harrowing that I did not know, I knew he had been involved in a stick-up. He was mugged outside of a home that he was living in Philadelphia near the college where I taught. And he called me in the middle of the night one night, shaken. His voice was high-pitched, called on a phone number I didn't know, and said, Mom, you have to come. I was just mugged. And so 3 o'clock in the morning, I drive to my campus and pick him up. I thought he was mugged, the story he told, and it was special fabricated stories that were masterful. I believed he was mugged standing outside smoking. And they got his backpack, they got his laptop, they got his phone. When I read the chapter, it's actually an extraordinary home invasion where he's held at gunpoint. And by somebody who he can tell is extraordinarily high and probably doesn't intend to kill him, but at any moment could accidentally. I had no idea the home invasion, no idea, until I read this harrowing side of the book. I had no idea the double life he was living, slipping into different clothing to go down to Kensington. It almost reminds me of that doctor you described, slipping into sloppy, lousy clothing to go down to Kensington to score what he needed and to come back. I had no idea the double life.
So I'm assuming there are people here who are parents or know people who have struggled with addiction. Looking back, do you think you could have or should have done anything differently?
I'm sure.
I mean, you were scrupulous. You were all over that kid.
I was all over this kid. As I said, it was years of battling. It was so unhappy for the whole family. A friend of mine has this expression that she says a family is a mobile. And so when one spins out, the whole place spins out with him. And that was what was going on as we saw him descend into deep addiction. And I never understood. I thought I understood addiction. I thought I had some sophistication. Of course, I believed in my heart he was struggling with addiction, but I didn't really want to call it that. I also wondered, is this experimental? Is this normal for a kid in junior high? I guess it was actually high school, college, and beyond. There's so much I wish I had done differently. At one point, I was going to hire a private detective. My husband said, no, we have to trust our children. I don't want to do that. I wish I had. I wish I had hired a private detective, because then I would have known in real time his double life. Sometimes I look back and I say, my God, I was stupid. When I first discovered...
You will not agree with that when you read the book.
When I first discovered he was smoking, we had a big house in Jenkintown, and I went in his room one day. We were battling, and I thought, I'm going in this room. I'm going to see what the hell's going on. For some reason, I was drawn to the windowsill. And in the windowsill, and the room was a disgusting mess, a high school disgusting mess. In the windowsill were these little cigars. Well, of course, they weren't really cigars. I called my husband. I go, PJ, you're not going to believe it. It's the worst thing. Harry is smoking. And cigars, of all things. My husband's like, Mad, this is not the worst thing. But I wasn't inquisitive enough to understand where that was, where he actually was. I just felt so sorry for him. I thought, what a sad, lonely experience sitting up here in your bedroom smoking. I didn't realize the path he was wandering down.
So I know I'm getting those looks because like the time is winding down. So let me just ask. I'm going to have to like cut to one of the chases here. We are privileged to have a congresswoman in our midst. And by the way, she knows our Mikey Sherrill.
Mikey Sherrill. She's my friend and colleague and classmate. Woo, Mikey!
Okay. How have your experiences as a mother trying to rescue a son with substance abuse disorder affected your role as a politician? Where do you stand on controversial harm reduction policies like legalizing fentanyl test strips? And a particularly fraught battle in Philadelphia, which I know about, is the possibility of a supervised drug injection site.
You might find this interesting. I'm more liberal than my son. And by the way, Harry really wanted to be here. I do want to explain that. Ironically, and you guys might object, we have won a journalism award by the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. He's in San Diego getting the award. Now, how we get a journalism award when I'm sitting with people like this, I have no idea. So I would love for you to have met him, and maybe one day we will. The question was, what?
Basically, how's your experience as a mother affected your role as a politician? And how do you feel about harm reduction policies like, legalizing fentanyl test strips and supervised drug injection sites, which is a big battle in Philadelphia?
I'm in favor of those things. We have to think outside the box. You just gave those extraordinary statistics. 105,000 people died in this country in a 12-month time during COVID of overdose. That's hundreds of people a day. I call it a jetliner a day. You know what we did when 2 Boeing jetliners crashed within a couple of weeks of each other? We grounded the planes. We said we have to figure out what in God's name's going wrong here. Well, we are losing every single day a couple hundred people. And it doesn't, of course, just steal the person. It devastates a family. It devastates a community. So it has caused me, and I will tell you, I was a state representative when we confronted Harry 9.5 years ago. He is 9 years, 6 months, and some number of days in long-term recovery from opioid addiction. Yeah, I agree. And that's the point of this book. The point of the book is to say there is hope. There is absolutely hope in recovery. But boy, oh boy, we as a society have to get our arms around it. We have to say, we have to think differently, think outside the box, support people who are struggling with substance use disorder. It is a disease. It is stigmatized as just something shameful. And Harry spent, while he slipped deep into addiction, he recognized in himself he probably won't make it to 25. And he was a new father. He had a little 1-year-old at the time we confronted him and he went to treatment. But he thought, based in his addicted state, I know I won't make it to 25. At one point when he was slipping away, right literally in front of my face, and I saw him grabbing onto his pants as the doctors tried to revive him, he thought in his own mind, and he writes about it, that it would be too shameful for my parents to know the state I'm in, that I'm an addict. It would be better for them that I die of overdose. I mean, this is the incredibly harrowing, hollowing that addiction does. And so I am much more liberal than even Harry is. I want injection sites, safe injection sites. I go down to, although now they've shut it down in Kensington, to the Love Lot, where people are getting help and passing out and overdosing and trying to get connected to help. But I think Philadelphia has a responsibility to open those.
So let me give you a golden opportunity, okay? Because you're sitting here with the U.S. Congresswoman, and you have written a book about really an evil empire. And I will tell you, the kicker in the book is an elegant and complicated notion that if INSIS had been smart enough to have in-house counsel throughout its daring do's, it probably would have escaped notice because it wouldn't have left such a paper trail. And I find that gives me small comfort to know they could have gotten away with it if they'd had in-house counsel. So, from your perspective, ask your Congresswoman here, what could be done by the DEA or the FDA to really, get better arms around controlling big pharma.
Oh, that's a good one. I have to recover from tears.
Yeah.
I've heard this expression a couple of places. A mother is only as happy as her unhappiest child. And being a parent now, I'm verklempt. But I guess I mentioned the state medical boards. I really have a problem with how slow their enforcement is. That's not a federal issue, so I'll come up with a federal one. The FDA sees it as their job, it is their job, to judge whether drugs that are being developed are safe and effective. But it's more narrow than that. It's safe and effective for a use that is specified by the manufacturer. So in this case, the indication of the drug, that the condition it was meant to treat was breakthrough cancer pain. Now the problem is that drug companies, once the drug is approved, they know how to market it outside the bounds of that indication. And they know that because doctors have the power to prescribe any drug for any reason. And they're not supposed to market it outside the bounds, but that's what they do. They always know that there's a bigger market, and in this case, a market that's totally inappropriate. Like if you have chronic back pain, you should not be taking a fentanyl spray. And it just bothers me that then when something like this happens, the FDA says, well, we don't regulate the practice of medicine. There's a kind of charade that goes on where the FDA approves a drug based on one premise, and that's not even the way it's going to be used. So I don't know how you solve that, but somebody has to be regulating the practice of medicine.
What do you think? If you had to balance between interdiction, meaning shutting down the number of counterfeit pills that come into this country, resources allocated to that, versus prevention and treatment, I mean, how would you do that? The Biden administration just released its drug policy finally after it's been a minute. And I think the DEA is, something like $3 or $4 billion, but the cartels in Mexico make easily, $20 billion a year?
Sadly, I think we're called upon to do it all, to make sure we inspect that which is coming in, which we don't inspect well enough. We capture some as it's coming in through our borders, through the ports, but we're not doing enough. And therefore, we also under-resource Border Patrol agencies and administration. We under-resource FDA, and to your point, don't allow them the teeth or the mechanism to actually follow what they said was the prescribed use of this and make sure that it's actually happening. Something else that became devastatingly interesting to me, and I haven't finished your book, Evan, to be very honest, but I am enjoying it, and you're a powerfully good writer, is the distribution patterns. So you have the prescribing patterns, but then there are the middle distributors. There's one in my district, and I've had some very plain, straight conversations saying you knew you were sending a tremendous number, a quantity, volume of pills to a particular set of communities. What's your responsibility in that? And they said, oh, that's really actually not on us. That's being tracked by, who's that being tracked by? Distribution patterns.
DEA.
It's supposed
DEA?
to be, but in the MDL litigation, the agreement that the distributors have made is that they're going to put tougher restrictions and watchword. They're going to watch each other.
Literally, that's the kind of thing they've said to me. I said, you saw the red flags. Why didn't you put them up? Money, dollars.
I'm getting all these raised eyebrows and clenched fists. I know our time is very short. I have a million more questions, but I feel like it's your turn.
Thank you so much. This is really informative. First, I don't know if I feel more comfortable or less comfortable with the idea that good legal counsel could have kept this under wraps. Yeah, just yikes. Two questions. Evan, for you, thank you. Very informative. As a journalist, and are you freelance?
Yep.
How difficult was it for you to get some of this information, like the data that they keep? That's fascinating to me. And Congresswoman, a quick question for you after Evan. Did you seek help for yourself? Where did you go for support as a parent?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that unlike Purdue Pharma or unlike almost any drug company of any kind, they went to trial. There were people who were arrested at the company instead of a civil action against the company where a dollar amount ends the whole ordeal for the company. They went to trial. And a trial, there's nothing like the public reckoning of a trial. It all comes out. I mean, all the affairs in the company. It's not, and there's some quite. Yeah, it's all there. It's not all just about pharmaceutical marketing, but yeah, that I mean, so I was greatly aided by people who went around with a badge and said, "Give me your documents." So it wasn't just me.
Thank you for that question. I feel as though I did my therapy before I found out exactly what was wrong and before I confronted Harry. I started to go to some meetings in my area, in Plymouth meeting, of parents who were dealing with their own kids who they knew were addicted. And I wasn't confident, but I thought I can listen and learn. And of course, you sit in any of those meetings, and I said, this is us too. This is absolutely us. I also met with, a turning point for me was a friend that I met with. Her son had been well, you don't get through addiction, had been addicted and went into recovery. And I sat with her. I went for coffee. I think the coffee was 3 hours long because the stories that I told and the stories that she told were so parallel, so similar. So I felt like my support for myself was in the discovery phase. And then I think my therapy has been as an elected official, first as a state representative. And it took me some evolving. I didn't come right out of the gate when Harry went into recovery and said, my son's an addict. But I immediately took it into my policy heart and made sure I was a part of any conversation or any legislation around addiction, mental health, substance use, parity of insurance, those kinds of things. And I began sort of by saying in hearings, addiction has touched my family. And it was a couple of years in before I finally said to Harry, would you mind if I tell our story publicly? This is way before book. I said, will it be all right with you because it's your story? And I want to protect you if you don't want me to say so. And he said, Mom, you are free to say it. So I think my therapy has been through my work too. And the book was therapeutic. I have to admit that. I had no idea. And I taught writing for 10 years. And I always say, my father was a talented writer. And I always told my students, writing is thinking. It helps you think this through. So the book was therapeutic and extraordinarily helpful to Harry and my relationship. We had already come back in love in his recovery, but I can't tell you how close this book brought us. And I have to say one other thing because it would be unfair. It's not as though it was Harry and me alone. It was a whole family affair, as you know. And we were finishing maybe the 9th edit of this book when my husband is typing away madly, and he had read the chapters over and over with us, and he hands Harry and me his own chapter called I Was There Too. And so I thought it was really good. We send it to the editors. They said, nah, never mind. So when it comes to paperback, they're putting his chapter in too. So I don't want anybody to think I was singularly in this with Harry. We were all in it together, and it can devastate families. In our case, we were very fortunate. It has drawn us closer.
I will say, though, as someone who has read both books very deeply, yes, there's a lot of sex in his book.
I didn't write about sex. I did not write about sex in my side.
No, but babies happen earlier in the process than you might think. But I will say there is a particularly gripping and grueling scene when everything comes apart when the Congresswoman and her husband it's so painful, confront Harry with their bank statements. You want to say what happened?
Yes, this was 1 week, 10 days before my election to the Pennsylvania House. I had won a special election. I'd served the end of a term, and it's election cycle. And our house is crazy. And as I said, Harry was a young father, and his girlfriend and our granddaughter Aubrey lived with us. So it's madness. It's a chaotic house, and there's other chaos going on in the house. And Harry and I were battling. And Harry was quite sickly at this point. It's not as though he looked healthy and robust and was just acting poorly. His affect was flat. I was like, what's going on, Harry? You're just not succeeding. You can't even get up on time. And so, in any event, my husband PJ said to me, Mad, would you please pay the American Express bill? I said, I would, but I tapped for some cash, and the balance is ridiculously low. We should have had, I'll say, $5,000 in there, and there's somewhere in the area of a few hundred. I said, I got to go into the bank. Harry also, PJ was traveling for work. Harry tapped on my bedroom door one night and said, Mom, could I borrow a little money? I said, I know Daddy just gave you some, and there's something wrong with our bank account, so no, you won't be getting anything from me. I got to go to the bank. He knew at that moment what I was going to find. And it was the run-up to Superstorm Sandy, yes. So we had a storm in our house. There's a storm outside. You'll see, he's stealing to stock up because of the storm approaching. I walked into the bank and I said, there's something wrong with my account. She prints me out the statement. She said, are you in the habit of using your ATM every night or every other night around midnight and taking out hundreds of dollars? I said, no, I certainly not. She said, somebody's stealing from you. Shall I call the police? I said, as soon as I looked at the papers and I saw where he was tapping it, I said, I know exactly what this is. I said, don't call the police. I said, something about family. And I walked outside and I called my husband. I said, it's drugs. This is it. $2,000 gone in a matter of no time whatsoever. We have to confront him.
But how did you feel at that moment? You've talked about, the issue of shame and stigma around addiction is a vast one. I'm going to write about it. But as a parent, I'm trying to imagine what you must have felt like knowing that. What were the first thoughts that, cracked your heart?
That's the word I was going to say. I was heartbroken. The violation of trust that you feel when the person, one of the people that I love most on this planet, who my husband and I would give anything to a fault probably, would give anything to, is stealing from you. I can't tell you how shattering that feeling was. And I worried at that day and for the days coming, will we ever trust each other again? And so it was shattering, heartbreaking, but also I was awake. This is it. I'm on a mission. I had already pre-examined where I wanted him to go. And I said to PJ, we're going to confront him. My friend had said, you're going to need an interventionist. And I said, maybe I am, but I'm doing it on my own first. I'm going to try it on my own. And so we called him and his girlfriend into the dining room. We put the bank statements on the table. And I said, Harry, I know what it is. It's drugs. Are you ready to get help? And for the first time in years, Harry had nothing to say. He was a fanciful storyteller, much like his Irish grandfather. He could fabricate a story and you just dance through the room like, wow, well, how could that have happened? He had nothing to say, and his eyes were dark and sullen and filling up. I said, are you ready to get help? And he said, yes.
Actually, if it's okay with you guys, I have a question also. I'm supposed to be working, but this is part of the conversation. I have a very, very, very close relative who spent a good portion of her life from early teenage years and for 20 some odd years after on drugs. She said if it was put in front of her, she would take it. And then she knew she wanted to stop. And she came to me and she said, they told me I could clean up on my own or I can go into the hospital. what do you think? And I said, no, you need to go into the hospital. So now it's 30 some odd years later, and thank God she's healthy and fine, and her daughter is well and feeling good. What was instrumental and remains instrumental in her life are the A groups, the anonymous groups. How have those helped your son, the people that you know? Are they connected with those? I know how they have affected my sister. She has no problem if I say that out loud. And that's my question to you as a parent.
Yes, and I can tell you, is that on? I think it's on.
Microphone on?
Can you hear me? Yes, I think I can hear you. Harry, when he came, he went for 28 or 30 days to the original place, then went to a 3-month program, all young males, and then came home. So 4 months worth of treatment. When we signed him up, when we drove him that very day to the first place of treatment, I knew 28 days was not going to do it. Harry didn't know that. My husband didn't know that. We had had a friend go to the same place for alcohol, and after 28 days he was home years earlier, and he did well. But I knew opioid addiction is not a 28 days and you're in good shape, go on home and go to a couple of meetings. If you have the chance to do this, I recognize not everybody has the chance. So he came home and he immediately signed up. He does the step work still, he does the meetings still, and he did some AA meetings, but pretty quickly found it was NA that he felt much more at home with. He even, as a first-year recovery, started an NA meeting in our community, an area particularly hard hit, and you know, was a host member of that committee for a long time until he moved to New Jersey. But meetings have been critically important all these years. I still once in a while ask him, how are the meetings? You know, I'm a nosy mother. How are the meetings going? And COVID, you know, the challenge of COVID and why these numbers are up, 20, 30,000 deaths in a single year during COVID, from a horrifying 70,000 to, over 100,000. COVID and isolation and loneliness and failure of that social support system and safety system has been devastating. He's been doing a lot of Zooms, but as I say, NA has been his place.
I was about to say that Zooming has allowed these past 2.5 years, many of these groups that had, dissipated because there were no place for them to be meeting, are still able to meet that way. Slowly but surely, I'm from the city, from New York, and slowly but surely there are meetings opening up. But it's still tentative, and I know how important, if for no other reason Zoom has become a benefit,
Yes.
it is for that and being able to perpetuate the A groups regardless of what your first letter is involved in it.
Zoom and telemedicine. COVID has taught us these are very valuable tools.
I have a quick question for you, Evan. It's something you sort of hint at in the book, but you don't really drill down into, so I don't want to ask you a question you don't know the answer to. That said, do you have any sense of what contributing role sepsis has played in the epidemic? Sepsis is the name of the fentanyl spray.
I do have some idea. It was a niche drug where the number of, I'm not actually sure this is working, the number of prescriptions was nowhere in the same league as OxyContin, so it wasn't a drug that flooded the streets, and in fact the patients tended to be older. They weren't reselling it on the street. They tended to be suffering legitimately from pain conditions. So it was not a drug that, was found in the car when you pulled someone over. And so the number of overdose deaths was actually somewhat a lot smaller than these other drugs. But part of the sort of premise of the book is that they were using the same playbook that all of the drug companies were using, and unfortunately I think are using. They didn't invent any of their tactics.
One thing I just really want to underscore, which I'm preaching to the choir here, is that even when we reporters talk about these very large statistics and we talk about them in terms of deaths, what we don't capture in those numbers is the far greater number of people who are struggling with addiction. So that is the true impact of what's going on. How many times someone has to be revived with Narcan, how many ER visits they make, the sort of trickle-down impact on the system, never mind the family itself. I mean, thank God Harry made it, but Harry was very much caught up in this as well, and is a statistic. His drug of choice towards the end is Percocet.
And what is also a part of this world is the number of friends he has lost. Some of the folks that he originally went in with, it was a young man's program for his first 28 days. I don't want to count how many are no longer here. I'm wearing a bracelet here for a friend of ours whose 24-year-old son struggled and recently overdosed. So there's a world of people struggling. The good news, Harry tells this statistic, and I should learn it, but most people, many or most people will get to recovery. Maybe you know the statistic better than I should learn it. So it's, even though these numbers are staggering, and we have to do everything we can to bend that curve down to nothing, most people will get to recovery. But part of recovery is also amazing loss, just devastating loss. Year after year, you lose friends, people you've worked with in NA or AA or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, but it's recovery provided that there's sources available for it. I mean, at least you're very candid in your book that the treatment that Harry got was quite expensive, and they own their privilege.
We had to examine that. The book forced us to look at ourselves. White suburban world means when connections, the ability, and I don't mean political connections. I mean, we knew the place where I wanted him to go for recovery. We had family there. We knew it was expensive. And I was so dogged determined. I said that the price is staggering, but it's the chance to save his life. But we recognize that, number one, not every family has that chance to say that, to say, I will spend what it takes. I'll borrow or beg. We actually had the ability to pay. And now, thankfully, more and more insurers are covering treatment, not just the first time, but if you have a relapse or a reoccurrence, good insurers are covering again. The other half of that privilege that we had to examine was the color of our skin and the socioeconomic status. There's an awful lot of folks. Harry was particularly young looking anyway, but cops would pull him over and they'd take one look at his license, the car he drove, the youthfulness of his face, and his white skin. And they would literally say, go home.
He's very candid in the book about Harry's candor and self-reflection. I admired so much in this book. I mean, it was really, he doesn't hide behind anything, and he very much owns the times that he is pulled over by cops over and over and over again and skates.
He's brutally honest, and that when I said we rebuild trust, he's so honest it's hard to take sometimes, but his writing is so honest, and the feeling that both the mental feeling and the physical feeling of using, he describes it so beautifully and horribly. He's a good writer and extraordinarily honest.
Not just from a mom, but from a writing professor. I think I'm getting the eyes, right? So I don't get my extra hour? Thank you very much for joining us. This is a terrible and critical topic, but you got to buy the books. I'm sorry, and I'm not getting paid anything to say that. I've been writing about this stuff for 4 or 5 years, and I learned a great deal from both of those books. So, thank you both for the work.
It's been a
you.
privilege.
Thank you.
My privilege.